Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue. It was in the recently published book, Seeing Voices by Oliver Sacks, that the public learned how appallingly recent has been the development which has enabled deaf persons to integrate in the larger society. It was not until 1755 that the first school for the deaf was established. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And it's with special interest that Austin Metropolitan Ministries brings this particular presentation pertaining to the hearing impaired. For it was from the religious community that the initial efforts were made to meet the needs of the deaf. Just over 200 years ago, Abbé de la Paix took the indigenous sign language of the deaf who roamed the streets of Paris and associated the signs with pictures and written words, thereby teaching the deaf to read and opening them to the world. Helping trace the way to which this process has been extended in the Austin community will be David Fair, pastor of the Austin Baptist Deaf Church, who will be communicating with the assistance of interpreter Mark Seeger. And Dean Cunningham, Assistant Director of Services for the Deaf for the Texas Education Agency. And we're pleased for having Doris Bailey from Travis County Services for the Deaf signing the program today. Now, hearing about the work of the church in Austin in relationship to the deaf, David, could you just share with us about your church and what other churches in town are providing these services with the deaf?
We have several deaf churches, and among those churches are the Lutheran Church for the Deaf, the Church of Christ for the Deaf, the Catholic Services, which have interpreted ministries, and then Bannockburn also has interpreted ministries. There's the Baptist Deaf Church and other churches that also have interpreted ministries.
Okay, so there's a difference between the churches that have interpreted ministries, so that have mostly people that hear, and the churches that are primarily with the deaf, and yours would be the example in that second category. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And what are the services that you provide for the folks in your congregation?
We have some Texas School for the Deaf students who attend our congregation, and then we have deaf people from the Austin community. And we focus on these two populations, the Texas School for the Deaf and the deaf community at large in Austin. We have people who come who are parents of deaf children, and we also have hearing children of deaf parents who attend our congregation. And then we have interested hearing people throughout the community who want to work with deaf people who come to our congregation. So those are the types of people that we have in our church. And we have voice interpreters for hearing people that attend our church.
I see. Now, your church is located not too far from the Texas School for the Deaf?
Yes, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. Whereabouts?
We're about 2 to 3 blocks away.
Okay. Well, thank you for that initial insight. And Dean, you're working with the State Texas Education Agency, and just give us an overall view of what services you render to the deaf community.
Well, the Texas Education Agency Division of Services for the Deaf is a comprehensive program of services in the educational realm for deaf students. We work through the public schools in the state of Texas. We have a line item in the budget of the Texas Education Agency, and we flow funds through the independent school districts in the state of Texas for the provision of all kinds of services in education. We actually negotiate a contract with about 50 fiscal agents, and through those fiscal agents, the ones who actually take the money and develop the program, we have 500 participating school districts. That means districts from which comes deaf students into a central location, or they provide services through teachers or satellites. And we employ through the public schools of the state of Texas about 600 teachers and a total of about 1,000 employees.
All right, so just what the Texas Education Agency does is comprehensive in regard to the schools. But there are services for the deaf other than what's through TEA.
Right.
What would those be?
Right. Well, many agencies have programs for the deaf. In fact, the interpreters that we have here this evening are from Travis County Services for the Deaf. And then through the Texas Commission for the Deaf, they have offices and centers throughout the state of Texas where interpreters and all kinds of services are delivered to the deaf in different areas of the state. One of the big agencies that has a large program for deaf people is the Texas Rehabilitation Commission, TRC.
I see.
And they have counselors who work with the deaf, and they have had for many years a counselor situated here in the Austin area who is deaf himself, who coordinates the work of deaf services throughout the state of Texas.
Now, the Texas School for the Deaf, is that under your department, or is that from some other agency?
The Texas School for the Deaf is under the general supervision of the State Board of Education. However, a few years ago, the Texas School for the Deaf was separated out from our division and set up under its own board and its own superintendent. So they are separate, but we have a very good coordination with the Texas School for the Deaf. And in fact, the Texas School for the Deaf is kind of a coordinating point for a lot of specialized materials that are developed for the deaf. We have cooperative workshops to train interpreters in the summer. We have a statewide conference that we just had last summer in Houston. 1,000 educators of the deaf and people associated with education of the deaf came to Houston for that conference, and it's co-sponsored by a parent group in the state of Texas, the Texas School for the Deaf and the Texas Education Agency.
Well, as you describe that, I can't help but think about this this development being relatively so recent. I mean, 200 years seems like a long time, but in the scheme of things, it is so short a span to have finally a response to this particular part of the community that you'll just pardon my naivete, but I'm amazed at just how much has been done in such a short time.
Well, this program that we're associated with through the Texas Education Agency is only 17 years old. That doesn't seem like a long time when you consider that the Texas School for the Deaf was established back in the 1800s, about the mid-1800s, with a land grant from the Texas legislature. And as you know, it's out on South Congress.
Right. And
so the deaf population was identified by the legislature for specialized educational treatment as long ago as in the mid-1800s.
All right. Well, David, you haven't been here since the mid-1800s. You've been in Austin just come relatively recently, and how long ago was that, and where did you come from?
I'm from Houston, Texas, originally. That's where I was born. And I attended school here in Austin at the Texas School for the Deaf, and upon graduation went to Gallaudet University and became an assistant pastor after I graduated, working in Alexandria, Virginia as the assistant pastor with a congregation, then moved here to Austin last April and began as a pastor here with this congregation.
How old are you, David?
I'm 26.
All right. And so you graduated from Gallaudet how long ago?
1988.
All right. And did you have theological training after that in a particular place that gave you the...
No, none after Gallaudet University. I went to a seminary in this past January, and I received some religious training there.
I see. But the primary emphasis in Gallaudet is on the skills that you need to communicate and your education in other ways besides for ministry.
Right, that's correct.
Now, I'm like others in the general public who have been struck by the controversy that was at Gallaudet, that the students, in a sense, rose up against the administration that were demanding change. Were you there at that time that happened? that they had the student protests?
Yes. When the Deaf President Now movement was going on, I was there, but after that time, I was not there during other controversies surrounding sign language.
Okay. But just to bring us up to speed, what was the issue at the heart of that controversy at Gallaudet?
Which controversy are you addressing?
In terms of why the students were protesting and what they were protesting about. The sign language, you said, had something to do with that.
They were protesting at that time because we had had hearing presidents up to that point. Some of them were interested in working with the deaf because perhaps their families had some deaf people involved in their families. And the last few presidents really knew nothing about sign language or the culture and were appointed from positions that had no relationship at all. And students there felt that they should appoint a deaf president and felt that that person should have qualifications that met the particular needs of a deaf student body that would affect deaf students in terms of leaderships. They had 6 candidates when they were going through the interview process. 3 of those candidates were deaf. We wanted them to choose one of those 3 candidates. The board did not select a deaf candidate. Instead, they chose a hearing woman, which caused the revolt on campus.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now let's go from that revolt on campus to the broader issue as you see it, Dean, and the Texas Education Agency. What broader issues are raised by that particular incident?
I think there's probably 2 areas that have had a great effect on the deaf and services for the deaf throughout the nation. Number one, there's a strong movement to have deaf leaders in key positions of leadership in all areas where deaf people are served. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to recruit more deaf people into education programs. We've tried to do that. We want our teacher training programs to turn out more deaf leaders who are teachers and in supervisory and administrative positions. The other area I believe that's continuing to affect everybody nationwide has to do with communication methodology, how we communicate in programs and services for the deaf. There's a strong move toward using the language of the deaf culture, which is American Sign Language. And then, you know, for many years we've been using signed English in school programs throughout the nation. And there's a lot of deaf people and a lot of hearing people who work with the deaf who believe that we should be incorporating more American Sign Language into our training.
Okay, well now, you lost me there. You've got the American Sign Language and you've got the signed English. They're not the same.
No.
And what's the difference?
David probably could explain a little better about ASL since it's his native language.
Okay, David, you're talking to us in ASL, is that correct? American Sign Language?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
There are 2 different kinds of sign languages. Really, there are 3, actually. We have American Sign Language. American Sign Language is like bad English for people who are speaking English. There are not words that have exact sign equivalents, and we don't include is, are, the, a lot of the shorter words in the English vocabulary. We're more conceptually based in American Sign Language. For example, I went store. We've eliminated the and some other words in that phrase. And then if you go into English signs, you would say, I went to the store, and you would include the is, the are, the in the phrase. Mm-hmm. Deaf people, for the most part, prefer American Sign Language. But there is a third group that falls in between these 2 that I've just described, American Sign Language and signed English. And that's where you put a combination of both of those together. Sometimes when deaf people communicate in this third category, they're usually communicating with hearing people who recently acquired sign language, or professionals who tend to use English as their language. Most deaf individuals among themselves will use American Sign Language. It's the preferred mode of communication. So there are 3 different modes of communication or languages that you can fall into.
Okay, so in a sense, the American Sign Language would be like the vernacular. It's the native tongue for the American deaf. Would that be a fair summary of that?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. It has a conceptual base. It's based on concepts and not words, whereas the English language is based on words. English language does not give concepts in terms of pictures, and it doesn't lend itself well to sign language and concepts.
It's more
and
literal
pictures.
in a sense.
Yes, yes. For example, tree. This is the sign for tree.
Okay.
And you see the branches here. You don't have to say, there is a tree with branches. You've said it all right here with the one sign.
I got you. All right.
That's the idea.
Now, when there was this first communication with the deaf in France, I would assume that they were using French as the context for their communication, and that if you were doing it in Chinese or if you were doing it in some other language of the world, they would use, instead of American Sign Language, they would use that of their particular country. Is that correct?
Yes, that is exactly correct. It's very interesting to note that sign language does not only come from France. The grammar base comes from England, the English grammar, and it was combined between the French language and the English language. In research, they found that signs also originate in America, that signs originate in France, that signs originate in England, and there are characteristics that we have gathered from all of these countries.
I see. Now, in terms of what's used as a basis for communication by the Texas agencies that you've named, Dean, is it American Sign Language, that is the vernacular that's used there, or do you also get into signed English, or this third language that David was talking about? What do you...
The third language, more or less.
All right.
But this is a tremendous area of problem for educators of the deaf, especially in Texas. We have a rather large state, as you know, and we have quite a number of students. The problem that we have in the Texas Education Agency is that we have different sign systems throughout the state. That is, the Texas Education Agency, the State Board of Education, the Commissioner of Education, decided a long time ago that the Texas Education Agency would not demand or require by law or by rule of the state board that school districts providing programs for deaf students use a certain communication methodology. Now, the reason for that is because we have different areas of the state where they have developed very good educational programs using a communication methodology other than ASL.
So you have to be eclectic.
You've got to be eclectic as far as the management of the program is from the state agency. But let me just mention a few of these. We have a new system that nobody's really too familiar with that's being researched a little bit out in Amarillo, Texas, called a morphemic sign system. And it's very new and is showing some promise in teaching language and reading to deaf students. It's just in the experimental research stage. We've got another system called C1, which is a system used in Richardson, Texas. It's a system that uses some ASL words and signs, but it also uses endings that are a little different, and it puts them in English word order.
All right, now I'm going to need to intercept you in the midst of this proliferation of means of communication, because we have something we need to share this on a statewide basis. Otherwise, it pertains more particularly to our religious community, and that is from the Knights of Columbus. So happens that this particular aspect of the Catholic Church has developed a program that we're going to have an opportunity to take a look at now, and maybe we'll come back to your response to that.
It wasn't until 1978 that the Catholic bishops of the United States issued their pastoral statement on handicapped people. In this document, they called for a deeper commitment to working for an understanding of the special needs of handicapped people, both spiritual and temporal. If handicapped people are to become equal partners in the Christian community, injustices must be eliminated and ignorance and apathy replaced by increased sensitivity and warm acceptance. On the national and diocesan levels, the Church is attempting to respond to the spiritual and social needs of the deaf by establishing a structure to integrate them into the life of the Church. But they have left much of the personal work and day-to-day activities to be handled at the parish level. Religious education programs for the deaf are the primary way that deaf people learn about the Catholic faith. These programs cover all levels of Christian development, from preschool through adult. They also include sacramental preparation programs for deaf adults, deaf parents, and hearing parents of deaf children. Deaf people are able to receive the Word of God and to participate more fully in the Mass when it's celebrated in sign language. Very few priests actually can sign, but in most cases, liturgies are interpreted in sign by a layperson. This can also pose a rather unique problem for a deaf person going to confession. Interpreting services are also provided for other situations that we in the hearing world take for granted, such as visits to the doctor or dentist, having your car repaired, banking, applying for jobs, making phone calls, or simply obtaining general information. These services are vital wherever the communications gap can be bridged with the hearing world. Sign language classes for the hearing are offered to help hearing people learn to communicate with the deaf. And from these classes come volunteers to teach religious and other educational programs. Through home visits, personal contact is made. Through these visits, it is possible to find many new people, and the connection between home and church is strengthened.
As you watch that, David, does that parallel what you're doing in your church in terms of a variety of services?
Yes, the idea is basically the same. However, we do conduct ourselves differently in that we have an entirely deaf church, and we handle it somewhat opposite of the way that they're handling it. By handling it oppositely, I'm saying that we have voice interpreters for those hearing members of the audience in the congregation.
I see.
That's how it would be handled differently.
Turns it around in that respect. Now, we need to also have the information shared with our viewers of where, if they'd like more information about programs either on the state level, Travis County level. I believe we have some numbers, and maybe we have the number of the church, too, that we can have displayed on the monitor for folks that might want to take that information. And I think that in regard to the work in the church, one thing that occurs to me is that in the ministry of Jesus with healing those who are hearing impaired, whether we catch something of the flavor of that from what we've seen here. Dean, you work in the church in this context. Can you give us a response to that?
About, for example, Jesus healing a deaf man?
Yes.
In the Bible? I mentioned to someone a few minutes ago, and we were discussing this, that I'm not at all sure that Jesus would have healed that deaf man the same as he would today, because deaf people in that culture were not treated the same as they are today. They've advanced tremendously. Mm-hmm. And I know some deaf people, some friends of mine, who would say that they would not want to be healed of deafness. Mm-hmm. Deafness is a cultural thing, and they have many advantages, so I'm not sure it would be exactly the same for them.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that, David, in terms of your preference?
I feel exactly the same as that concept. I would not want to be healed. I'm proud to be deaf. I think that God has created me as a deaf individual so that I can communicate with other deaf people and let them know about Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. So that you see that that is the same kind of reality that whether you're deaf or you're hearing, you're drawing from the Word of God, and it's not presupposing that to be hearing or deaf interferes with that essential communication. You can hear the Word just as well, is what I discern. And when you do the Lord's... Yes. So I'm wanting to have a little bit of the sense of that prayer life that you lead. Could you give us what the Lord's Prayer, how that would be communicated to us in terms of the way you would do it with your congregation?
Sure. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us as we forgive those. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Mm-hmm. As I receive that from you, I have the sense that there's a very special power that's involved in that form of communication beyond and in a sense supplementing or being as much a part of that prayer life as in words. Is that your experience in church?
I think it is. I believe that we've seen the use of sign language in church music has grown tremendously, and the reason it's so much more expressive is you get your body into it.
Yes, I guess that's it.
It becomes physical as well as spiritual and mental.
Right. You have an advantage from that standpoint, and those of us in the hearing community, I think, could learn from that. And we've certainly learned a great deal from both of you here, and very much appreciate your being with us, Dean Cunningham and David Fair, and the support of those who are doing our signing today with us. And after having gained this information and insight as to what's happening in Austin in regard to these ministries and services with the deaf, we want to thank you for watching. And in behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, be with us again next week. And peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.